Hello, buddy. Welcome back to the Tin Man Score channel. I'm your host, Jeffrey Tin Man Taylor, and today I'm reacting to another Midnight Tales video for you guys. And this was 5 really scary true church horror stories. I'm going to turn the lights off, move the camera up here for you guys, and let's get this reaction on the road and in the bag. Okay, here we go.
I was a young and naive youth minister working my first job at a church.
Okay.
I was very eager to get to know my kids and their parents. I had developed a pretty active program that was attracting new kids every day. One day, a single father and his young son showed up. At first, it seemed like a typical story. The dad was a big guy, not fat, just overall large, but he had a creepy vibe. He was missing some teeth and rarely smiled, which flagged my intuition. The boy was a troublemaker from the start. On his first day, he was already pushing other kids around and behaving like a bully with serious issues. The father had a sob story about leaving an abusive wife, which garnered some sympathy. The little boy began regularly attending youth events, and so did the father. This, in itself, seemed normal. One day, I was sitting alone in my office and heard a noise coming from the copy room. I didn't think much of it since our door was locked, and entry required either a key or someone to be buzzed in.
Before he continues, I would like to say that if somebody's acting like a bully to other kids, maybe you need to take them through one of them, I don't know, scare straight programs where they pretty much scare you out of being a bully, like in a prison or a military school camp or something. Because you just taking them straight to a church related program, he ain't gonna commit to it just like that. But let's continue on with the story.
I assumed another staff member was in the building. After a few minutes, I heard a child's voice and stepped into the lobby. There stood the creepy dad and his son, rummaging through the office cabinets. I had no idea how they got in, so I grabbed my cell phone and stayed in the lobby with them. I told them I needed to arm the office and run some errands, implying they would have to leave. In reality, I was trying to find a way to get them out. It was against our ethics policy to be alone with congregants in the building, for the protection of both the ministerial staff and the congregants. As we exited, they went out one door while I went out another. I kept my phone in hand as I got into my car, but the creepy dad knocked on my window. My car was old and lacked power windows, so I manually rolled the window down just a bit. He asked if I would babysit his son. He explained that he had left his son alone last week, and the child had peed all over the apartment, so he was looking for a babysitter who could be a positive influence. I declined, citing other obligations. The man then tried to open my car door and push down the window, pleading with me to reconsider. I finally said I needed to run errands immediately, and he left. I drove away, but I knew he would linger around. To buy time, I went to grab a snack and iced tea at my favorite fast food spot. When I returned to the church, he was still there. I called an older church member who lived nearby, and by the time we returned, the father and son were gone. The following week, I heard them in the office again. I still didn't know how they were getting in or what they were looking for. This time, the father wanted to tell me about a Jesus documentary he had DVR'd and invite me over for dinner to discuss it. He even mentioned buying wine. I declined. He then extended an invitation for the youth group to come to his apartment and watch the documentary. I suggested we could watch it at the church, and he became visibly agitated. Soon after, I started receiving strange text messages, such as, "You look so pretty today," and "I like that blue shirt." This happened even on days I wasn't at the church. One Sunday morning, I was using my phone during a children's message at the front of the church when it began to ring. The number belonged to the person sending me those texts. I ignored it, but the caller kept trying while laughing in the back of the church. He later admitted to pranking me, confirming that the texts were from him and that he had been watching me even when I wasn't at church. The messages eventually took a perverse turn. I received texts from my secret admirer containing graphic details about imagined dates. I had mentioned the texts to my male supervisor, who suggested I respond with a firm rejection. However, my seminary professor advised me to ignore them, which I did. This angered the creepy dad. His messages turned threatening, saying, "If you don't reply, you will regret it." While attending a summer camp with kids, I confided in a female minister, who told me bluntly that this man was a predator, and I needed to deal with him. A male co-minister called him, and warned that I would press charges if he didn't stop. In retaliation, the man complained to the church board, accusing me of leading him on and being the one to send the explicit messages. He even claimed I was flirting with him in church when interacting with him and his child.
Oh, that's a bunch of bull crap. They're just trying to get that preacher fired, and they are both a bunch of creeps. And the fact that he's leading his son into all this, ugh, just gross.
Which was simply my job. It was only then that the senior minister took me seriously. I had been forwarding the messages to him, and he was shocked by their content. Initially, my supervisor didn't believe me, insisting that sexual harassment by a congregant toward a minister doesn't happen. Things escalated. Whenever I led a prayer or sermon, the creepy dad would walk out, stand outside a window, and stare at me until I finished. Eventually, a member of the congregation who was friends with the female minister connected the dots. This man wasn't only harassing me, but also targeting 5 other women in the church. We discovered he had been going from church to church in the area, preying on single women by using his child as bait to elicit sympathy. The church faced a dilemma. While it was open to everyone, allowing a known predator to stay was making many people uncomfortable. He eventually had to move away due to work, but the entire ordeal still haunts me to this day.
Well, I'm glad he moved away because of his work position, but still, you should have got the cops involved and got him arrested or have him banned from that church. And to be honest with you, I went to church, I'd be creeped out if somebody was stalking me over there to where I don't want to go back. I know that'll be a sad realization, folks, but you just don't know who walks into the church doors now.
This happened when I was a kid living in La Mesa, California. I was about 5 to 7 years old, I think. We belonged to a moderately large Protestant church with a cheerful congregation, and all of the families were tight-knit, though there were plenty of non-regular attendees. I've always been a very willful person, with a bit of an invincibility complex and a feverish curiosity. As a little girl, you couldn't tell me not to go somewhere before finding that I was already there. I loved exploring and being alone, and this story is about the day I realized that wasn't always the best idea. It's hard to explain just how stubborn I am. My parents were well aware of this, and always tried to communicate concepts of danger and fear to me, but they didn't make much sense. If something was scary, then you should confront it and fight it. That was essentially my motto at 6 years old. I had run along cliffs, swam farther than I was supposed to where rip currents were known to happen, played in the street, and sought out strangers to meet. You can imagine the stress I caused my poor mother. But this day was the first time I felt a genuine pang of danger, a tiny thrill of concern that something very bad might be about to happen. When church let out on Sundays, everyone would head to the courtyard, offices, or kitchens to help, leaving the sanctuary empty within minutes. While waiting for my parents to leave, I liked wandering around the balcony where the choir sang and exploring the organ or stained glass. Sometimes, I sneaked around in the back, trying to get onto the roof or playing where the vestments were kept. There was a behind-the-scenes area separated by doors from the elevated front of the sanctuary. I had just been poking around there when I decided to leave and heard someone call out to me. I turned around and saw a man, likely in his 20s or 30s, with stringy blondish hair. His clothing suggested a disorganized mind, not homeless, but casual and worn enough that even my younger self noticed something off. He greeted me warmly, as though we were old friends. I vaguely remembered meeting him before in this very room. He had introduced himself as people from the choir walked past, putting their things away. He seemed flustered at the time, making small talk before I left. I didn't remember his name or any specifics about him, but I greeted him politely.
That's sort of a good thing you greeted somebody politely, but if they're dressed the way you're describing, like worn clothes and stringy hair, that tells you it might be a stalker. But let's just see how this interaction goes.
There was no one else back here. The door on the other side was locked, so I wondered how he had gotten behind me without me noticing. Hadn't I gone all the way around when I first entered? It didn't make much sense. He asked if everything was okay, and I said yes, but I had to go. He then said, "Wait a minute. Don't you want to hear how I'm doing?" I replied yes, but mentioned that my parents were waiting for me. A lie. The man proceeded to tell me he was fine and then asked for a hug, moving in for one before I could react. I said okay, feeling like it was unavoidable. I didn't want him to realize how opposed I was to being near him. At that moment, I wished someone, anyone, especially an adult, was nearby. I started thinking about how unlikely it was for anyone to come in, how far away everyone was, and how, despite the sanctuary's good acoustics, no one would hear me if I yelled. He held on to me for what felt like an eternity, minutes passing by. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I said, "Okay, well, sorry, but I have to go." I felt him begin to let go, but then pause, giving me goosebumps. The bad kind. I stepped back, and he finally released me, but his eyes had changed. He looked down at me with a calculating gaze, as if he knew I was lying and that I didn't want to be there. His eyes narrowed. I tried to smile convincingly, hoping to maintain the facade that I was having a good time, to keep him playing his previous game. Though I didn't fully understand the situation, I grasped the basics of the animalistic behavior at play. After a moment of tense silence, I said, "Nice to see you. Hopefully I'll see you next week when we're not leaving. Bye." I forced a big smile, looked him directly in the eyes, and turned to ascend the few steps leading out to the sanctuary. I could feel him watching me, still calculating. Trying not to run, those few seconds felt like some of the longest of my life. Every step, I feared he would grab me and pull me back into the room. When I reached the sanctuary, I picked up my pace, eventually skipping the rest of the way and bursting through the doors into the bright sunlight and the sound of people talking.
Yeah, that's right. Go find your parents and alert them about this strange guy. Because I'd be going to like the head of the church and be like, "Do you know this guy?" Because he was just talking to me. He tried to grab onto me, and then see if they can get him banned from the church. But yeah, that's creepy. I'm glad she got out of there unharmed otherwise.
I am a 47-year-old female. When I was about 11 years old, we lived in Oakville, Texas. My dad was the preacher of the little Baptist church right off I-37, and we lived in the parsonage just behind the church. My dad was also a mechanic in the next town over, Three Rivers, and was gone during the day Monday through Friday. By the way, I have an awesome dad, super funny, very protective, kind, and generous. I had an older sister who mostly ignored me and didn't want to play. The town was small with very few kids to play with, so I often ended up playing with Barbies or other toys alone. I felt very safe playing in and around the church grounds. I usually ended up playing inside the church during the hottest parts of the summer days because our house didn't have air conditioning. Since the church was usually locked, I would get the key from the kitchen, unlock the door, and then return the key later. One Monday midday, I went into the church, and something seemed off. I played there often, so I knew the typical smells and where everything went. I noticed that the church hallway smelled different, kind of musty. As I walked slowly around the church, I had a weird feeling of being watched. I mostly played in the auditorium, setting up my Barbie world all over the pews. I usually cleaned up my messes each day and put all my toys into a satchel I carried back and forth from home. That day, I set up as usual, but I kept hearing the building creak, the air conditioning turn off and on, and other noises. I also felt uneasy and would periodically stand up to peer over the back pew and check out the room. All summer long, I continued going into the church to play, but I kept noticing small things out of place. Since ours was a small country church, no one typically went in or out during the week. The custodial work was handled by the preacher and his family, us. My job was to vacuum and empty garbage cans. I started noticing odd items in the garbage. An old t-shirt, magazines, definitely not appropriate for a church environment.
Probably a strange homeless guy broken into the church.
Especially for an 11-year-old. And strangest of all, words and drawings on paper. The drawings were unusual, and the words and poetry were dark and sad. Every day, little things seemed off, but not enough for me to tell my mom or mention it to my dad when he got home. One Saturday, my dad was home and asked me to go over to the church to get some paperwork from his office. The pastor's study was just off the auditorium. I walked in and stood by the back pew. There were windows in the auditorium, so I could see clearly even with the lights off. I noticed a hazy smoke settling around the front area near the podium. I hadn't been around cigarette smoke much, but I suddenly realized that the smell I had been noticing all summer was stale smoke. As I turned to go into the study, I saw that the door was open. It was always locked and closed, and felt a deep sense of dread. I ran as fast as I could out the back of the church and into the house. My dad, sitting and drinking coffee, looked at me. I told him everything in one big breath and started crying. Immediately, my dad grabbed a shotgun and went over to the church, Texas preacher man style.
There you
He
go.
found a homeless man living in a utility closet. The man had been there all summer while I had been playing alone in the church. He had come in through a window in a Sunday school room. Later, my dad told me the whole story. The man had been in and out of jail for petty theft and breaking and entering. He was a 27-year-old who needed a home and a family, but had neither. My dad helped him get a job and a place to stay at a local ranch, and he ended up doing okay. He even started attending church some the following year. My dad befriended him, and the man eventually apologized to me personally for scaring me. I'm sure my dad made him do it. I remember the pain in his eyes when he apologized, and I sincerely hoped he would be okay. Years later, I asked my dad about him. Dad told me that the man eventually married and had a baby girl.
Yep, just I figured homeless man, but I'm glad that he didn't have no sinister intentions and the preacher did not end up shooting him. Glad to hear that the story changed from a negative to a positive where the man got a job and place to stay and then he attended church with them. Now he's starting a family. Also, I'm glad that he apologized to that girl because he should have just made his presence known instead of like breaking and entering and scaring the crap out of that girl. But yeah, I'm glad he was able to get his life straightened out.
This happened 5 years ago today, marking the 5th anniversary of the experience. At the time, I was a shy, conservative, religious, and sheltered college student whose social interactions largely depended on school-related activities. Today, I am still quite shy and conservative, though not as religious. Currently, I am a NEET with minimal social interaction, but I digress. Being the religious person that I was back then, I had requested that my family and I attend Mass on the last Sunday of the year. When Sunday came, my mom was the only one willing to accompany me. We decided to attend the last Mass of the day, which was at 6 or 7 in the evening, as it was too hot during the afternoon, and I wasn't keen on waking up early for morning mass. When we arrived, the mass had already started, and all the pews were occupied, so we stood at the very back of the church. The mass itself was fairly typical, except for a woman who fainted during the priest's homily. I didn't feel that anything was amiss during the service. After Mass, people customarily approached the priest, who stood before the altar, to receive his blessing. I intended to do the same, which meant walking down the entire length of the church. As I walked down the aisle, I suddenly had the feeling that I was being followed. In the years since, I've experienced what it feels like when friends try to catch up to me, but this sensation was entirely different. I hoped I was imagining it, but my instincts were proven right when a man appeared at my left side. He was taller than me. I'm 5'2", and he was around 5'7". I couldn't determine his exact age, but I guessed he was older than I was at the time, perhaps in his early 20s. I had no idea who he was or what he wanted. He started asking me personal questions, like my name, age, and where I lived. Despite my lack of social skills, I knew that following someone around a church at night and bombarding them with personal questions was not a great way to make friends.
You definitely don't do that when you start a friend relationship. You do all that like throughout the course of time, basically.
I felt uncomfortable, but was too polite to ignore him outright. I answered his questions, but all my responses were false or vague. I gave a fake name, a different age, etc. When I finally approached the priest, I hoped to get his attention and perhaps signal that I needed help, but he seemed indifferent, focusing on blessing whoever was in front of him. Feeling betrayed, I glanced around at the other people nearby, but they were all preoccupied with their own business. I couldn't blame them for that. My last resort was my mother. I turned around and speed walked to the back of the church, but when I reached the spot where we had stood earlier, she was gone. I panicked and began frantically scanning the church. The man was still following me, now asking me where I went to school. I didn't want to engage with him anymore, or have him near me. In my desperate search, I finally spotted my mom sitting in one of the pews at the back. I darted straight to her, quickly and breathlessly explaining that I was being followed and we needed to leave immediately. Mom, understandably surprised, glanced at me, then at the man, and then back at me. She stood up, took my hand, and we walked out of the church together. By the time we reached the car, my heart was racing, and I was shaking slightly. Ever the optimist, I tried to rationalize that perhaps the man had good intentions. Mom suggested he might have just been socially awkward or inept. However, everyone else I shared the story with believed otherwise. For a time, I avoided going near that area without my brother, and gradually lost my dedication to my faith due to this experience.
Well, I'm sorry to hear about that, because nobody should be scared of their own church just because of a member asking weird questions. Like your mama said, he'd probably been socially awkward and did not know how to engage a conversation. But then also, he probably was somebody that might have had worse intentions. But I'm glad he did not follow you all the way out to the car.
This happened when I was around 17 years old, and it continues to affect me. At 17, I felt lost in the world, stuck in a job I disliked, and surrounded by colleagues who didn't like me. This was largely due to my accent, as I spoke differently, leading them to assume I was privileged. It all began on a Friday after work. The factory I worked in had half days on Fridays, so I would often spend the rest of the day wandering around the city. It had been a particularly tough day of relentless teasing, and I was reaching my breaking point. I walked around the city looking for a new job, visiting places like the Police Recruitment Center, the Army, Navy, Air Force centers, and even the International Red Cross. I just wanted to escape my current situation. After a few hours, I had a bag full of career pamphlets, but still no sense of direction. Then, I turned a corner and noticed a sign. Free personality test. Are you curious about yourself? Come in. Above it, I saw a large sign that read, The Church of Scientology. Before I continued, yes, I was aware of Scientology and had heard all the stories about it. However, I had a strange curiosity about the place. I'd heard the horror stories, but I'd also seen Tom Cruise, who seemed to have his life together. So, I went inside. I was greeted immediately by a friendly woman who asked how she could help me. I mentioned that I was interested in learning more about the church and the personality test. She smiled and said, I'd be happy to help. Please take a seat, and I'll find someone for you to speak with. Shortly afterward, I was introduced to Alan, the head of the city's Scientology Center. Alan led me into a small room for a private conversation. Upon entering, I noticed a large picture of Ron Hubbard on the wall. We sat down, and I had what seemed to be a genuine conversation with Alan. I shared how unhappy I was with my job and life situation. He seemed empathetic and appeared to want to help. Eventually, I agreed to take the personality test.
I don't even know what Scientology is. Hey, let me look it up real quick. Okay, what I found is the key Scientology beliefs include reincarnation and that traumatic events cause subconscious command-like recordings in the mind that could be only removed through an activity called auditing. But it seems like it's a set of beliefs and practices. And it was developed by the American author L. Ron Hubbard. But some define it as a cult, a business or religion, or even a scam, but also represented as a form of therapy. Okay, that's a big long answer. So, in other words, it's another type of religion, but in like a business practice. Let's put it that way.
Alan handed it to me and left, instructing me to give it to the receptionist once completed. The test was no joke. It took me 2 hours and consisted of around 500 questions covering various topics.
500 questions? Oh, I'll be darned. Because if it ain't like multiple choice, then I don't know if I could do it. Nah, I'll probably fail that test.
After I handed in the test, the receptionist informed me that processing would take some time. Meanwhile, Alan arranged for me to watch a film in their private cinema. I expected a small room with a TV, but it was a legitimate cinema that could seat around 50 people.
Jeez.
Although it felt odd being alone in a Scientology-owned cinema, I stayed to watch. The film was about 30 minutes long, with a narrator discussing feelings of doubt, self-worth, and past events that might affect one's life. One segment claimed that experiences your mother had while pregnant could negatively impact you. For example, if she was sick on a flight, you might have a fear of flying. Absurd as it sounds, parts of it resonated with me. After the film, I was taken to Alan's office, where he shared my test results. He told me I was deeply depressed, unmotivated, lacking in cognitive ability, and wasting my potential. His words upset me deeply, but he offered a solution, a course that could change my life. He convinced me to buy several books and a DVD, telling me to read and watch them before starting the course. I reluctantly handed over a significant amount of money for the course, and was told I'd receive an email with details. I left the center, went home, and spent the entire weekend absorbed in the books and DVD. I locked myself in my room, reading and rereading the material, trying to understand and implement what I'd been told. Over the next week, I began taking notes about myself and my family. I emailed Alan with questions, becoming increasingly critical of my mother and blaming her for my problems. Alan suggested that if she was the source of my issues, I should consider disconnecting from her. I took this advice seriously, even planning to cut her out of my life. By the time the course was about to begin, I had developed a toxic superiority complex. The book suggested that I was destined for greatness, leading me to treat my family as inferior. Fortunately, days before the course started, my parents confronted me. They had noticed my behavior and searched my room, finding the Scientology materials. I was furious, screaming and saying horrible things to them. Yet, despite my behavior, they managed to reach me. They told me that if I was so unhappy, I should have spoken to them. They made me see the danger I was in. That night, after the argument subsided, my parents comforted me despite how I had treated them. The next day, I emailed Alan, informing him that I wouldn't return. He quickly replied, asking if my family was forcing me to leave. I ignored him. Over the following weeks, I received increasingly desperate messages, some of which were threatening and manipulative. He even suggested I might end up dead by suicide. One particularly strange email contained only binary code, which made no sense when translated. I eventually blocked him, but I still receive occasional emails from new people claiming to be concerned about me. Whenever this happens, I block the sender. To anyone considering visiting a Scientology center, please don't. If they could manipulate me so thoroughly in such a short time, imagine the impact over months or years. If you're feeling lost or upset, please talk to trusted family, friends.
Lesson learned. I can't believe that this actually exists when they kind of push out there that they're there to help you, but then they're making you do things through cognitive therapy. Turn out to be a whole daggum scam. But anyway, that's going to be it for now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on post notifications for more Midnight Tales reactions like this. This has been another successful installment of the Tin Man's Quarter channel. I'm your host, Jeffrey Tin Man Taylor. I'd say that's a wrap, and have a nice day.